and revolt, and this is described battle by battle by battle in the book of the Maccabees. And I had mentioned there are 4 books that are called Sefer HaMaccabees. 3 and 4 are historical, are philosophical, but only 1 and 2 are historical. And it's very, very interesting that both books go over largely the same events, the same period, the same events. They're duplicative, but it's very, very fascinating what is the emphasis in each book. Each book has a different emphasis in what is the yesod of this milchama against the Yevanim. Now, again, both books are religious books. By that I mean both books have the hashkafa that it's only HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we have to serve. And the war against Antiochus was not a political war. It was not stamazai to establish a government. It was to be able to keep the Torah. So one should not look at this as a glorification of militarism. It was all the Shem Shemayim. But there's a different focus as to who are the heroes of the story. In Sefer Maccabees 1, the heroes of the story are the soldiers who fought. Yehuda HaMaccabee, the great soldiers, the fact that they were so brilliant in their military strategies and the like. So the glorification is that of the chayolim, so to speak. In Maccabees number 2, the glorification was not of the chayolim. The glorification was that of the martyrs. In fact, many, many famous stories of people who died al Kiddush Hashem are in Maccabees number 2. One of the most famous stories of Hanukkah is a story of Chana, a woman whose name was Chana, and she had 7 sons, and all of those sons were killed because they refused to bow down to idols, and one son was killed after the other son, until we come to the very last child, a little boy, that even Antiochus had mercy. He didn't want to kill this last little child. So he said to the kid, you don't have to bow down to the idol. I'm just going to throw my ring on the floor, bend down to pick up my ring, so it'll look like you're bowing down to the idol, and I'll spare your life. And the little kid told Antiochus that I'm not going to do anything that's going to make people think that for 1 second I bow down to an idol. So Chana's 7th child died. She lost 7 children, al Kiddush Hashem. That story, which is a well-known story of Hanukkah, appears in Sefer HaMaccabees number 2. So it's an interesting emphasis. Who are the heroes of Hanukkah? Is it the great army that fought Antiochus? Or is it the people who died al Kiddush Hashem? Now the emphasis, these are not contradictions. It's elu v'elu. There were the stories of the soldiers, and there were the stories of the people who died al Kiddush Hashem. So one book emphasizes one aspect, and one book emphasizes another aspect. Very interesting. So I don't want to get too much involved in politics, but this actually mirrors or echoes a controversy that occurred in Israel much, 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 much later. You know, as you know, one of the holidays on the Israeli calendar, Israeli secular calendar, is Yom HaShoah, right? There's a day in the month of Nisan that commemorates the Holocaust. It's called Yom HaShoah. It's interesting. There are different halachic problems. You know, Yom HaTzma'ut, which is celebrated as a festive day, is halachically problematical, among other reasons, because it's during the counting of the Omer, where you're not supposed to have big parties. And Yom HaShoah, which is a very sad day, is in the month of Nisan, where you're not allowed to have sad occasions. So, in a sense, Yom HaShoah is in Nisan, and that's a problem, and Yom HaTzma'ut is in Iyar, and that's a problem. Okay, but putting that aside, why was the day in Nisan, I don't remember the exact calendar date, but it starts the end of Nisan, but why was that day chosen as Yom HaShoah? Because that was the day of the fall of the Warsaw Ghetto, the Hebrew date of the day of the fall of the Warsaw Ghetto. Okay. Why is that so controversial? It was in the early years of the State of Israel, it was enormously controversial. And that is because among the Zionist founding fathers and mothers, there was a certain embarrassment about the fact that 6 million Jews were killed. Why didn't they fight? Why didn't they oppose the enemy? Why did they go like sheep to the slaughter? And there was a concept that that's the gullus Jew. The gullus Jew is weak and powerless and unable to stand up for themselves. But these early Zionists were trying to create this model that the new Jew is not going to be pushed around anymore. The new Jew is going to be tough. And therefore, they were actually ashamed of a lot of the victims of the Holocaust. So when they wanted to memorialize the Holocaust, they picked one of the very few occasions where indeed Jews had an armed uprising against the Germans, and that, of course, was the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, the Warsaw Ghetto, too, the people who were fighting are considered to be evacted al Kiddush Hashem. Rav Menachem Zemba, who was one of the Gedolei Hador, who died in the Warsaw Ghetto, said that this is how we sanctify God, by fighting Rishayim. But you have to understand that back in 1948, when Yom HaShoah was chosen, and in those days there were many, many Holocaust survivors. This was only 3 years after the end of World War II. There were many people that were deeply hurt that the one thing you're glorifying about the Holocaust is the time when Jews fought against the enemy, as if to say you're denigrating those who didn't fight because there was nothing they could do, and they just died passively, accepting their fate, al Kiddush Hashem. So everything in Israel is political. Even the question of what day should be Yom HaShoah was actually deeply painful to a lot of Holocaust survivors who felt this was an implicit slap in the face to all of those who were not involved in armed revolt. So it's interesting, Lanias Daiti, one might say, that this was the machlokas between whoever wrote Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2. Maccabees 1 takes as its model of heroism those who fought against the Yevanim. And Maccabees 2 takes their model of heroism as those who were willing to die al Kiddush Hashem without betraying the Torah. Which is emes? It's a davar pashut. Elo v'elo divrei Elokim chayim. It's a davar pashut that both things are true. But each mechaber is emphasizing a different nekuda. You know, people raise the interesting question. It's really not our subject per se. We commonly say that the people who died in the Holocaust died al Kiddush Hashem. Right? We call them, they died al Kiddush Hashem. And the question is that really true? Because the standard case of al Kiddush Hashem is when you're given a choice. Right? The Crusades, they go over to you and say, convert, reject Judaism or I'll kill you. And a person says, I am willing to die before I reject the Torah, before I bow down to idols. And the person dies. That's Kiddush Hashem. Because they had a choice, they had a way out. They could have rejected the Torah and they would have lived. But they were willing to die instead of rejecting the Torah. They gave their lives to sanctify God's name. The problem with the Holocaust, in the sense, is, once again, there was no choice that's involved. Meaning, you weren't given the choice. Reject your Judaism and you'll live, like Antiochus, right? So in the Maccabees, this Antiochus is Kiddush Hashem too. There was that element of choice. So here's the point. The point is, if they're going to kill you, whether you're religious or not religious, if they're going to kill you, whether you reject the Torah or don't reject the Torah, then in what way can your death be seen as a sanctification of God's name? You didn't take any position on this. As I said yesterday, there were Jews who even converted to Christianity. I mean, before the war, and they were still rounded up and they were still killed in the concentration camps. Hitler didn't care, just like Haman didn't care. So the interesting question is, how can we talk about those who died in the Shoah as dying al Kiddush Hashem? Now, there is something that people quote from a Tshuvas HaRambam, although this quote cannot be located anywhere, so it's not clear, where the Rambam says, anyone that is killed because they're a Jew, meaning, if a guy gets killed in a car accident and he happens to be Jewish, that's not Kiddush Hashem, that much we'll admit. But if somebody was killed because they are Jewish, even if they're not religious and even if they didn't have a choice to get out of it, some quote a Rambam to maintain that is considered to be al Kiddush Hashem. The emes is it's not clear if the Rambam says that or where the Rambam says that. I mean, there's some lashon where you could get such an inference, and it's not even clear what the svara of that statement is. If I happen to be Jewish, but I don't practice Judaism, I don't believe in Judaism, and I die just because Hitler considered me a Jew, why is that automatically Kiddush Hashem? But Rav Dessler has a beautiful essay, a very, very powerful essay, which is not a complete answer. But he points out that at least in some cases, there can certainly be Kiddush Hashem even if you didn't have the choice of saving your life. There's a Kiddush Hashem in the way you approach death. And he was writing out of a very, very personal experience. Rav Dessler grew up in Kelm. Kelm is a city on the German-Polish border. And Kelm, of course, was a great, great Musar city. Rabbi Sosalanter's primary Talmud, Rav Simcha Zissel, was called the Alter of Kelm. And he had started his great school, his great yeshiva, which put a tremendous emphasis on character building. And many of the great Bali Musar of the next generations came from Kelm. And Rav Dessler's family grew up in Kelm. That was where he absorbed his chinuch. He left Europe before World War II. He went to England, and that's where he was during the war. But all of his family were wiped out in Kelm. Kelm was a city that was massacred by the Nazis, and there were very, very few survivors. But Rav Dessler describes, I guess he had heard from some eyewitness survivors, what the massacre of Kelm was like. There was a Rav Daniel Moshovitz, certain great, great people of that yeshiva. And it talks about the fact that one of the things that the Alter of Kelm always taught was you have to approach every nisayon in life with calmness, serenity. And these people just prepared. They lived their lives to serve Hashem all of their lives. And now their avodah is to die in a calm way, in a reflective way, in doing tshuva, in a way in which they're ready, as it were, to give their lives to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Rav Dessler pointed out, this is really such an amazing thing. He said that the Nazis themselves were spooked out by this. They loved when people would scream and cry and fall apart and beg and grovel, which is a normal human response. Somebody's about to shoot you in the head with a machine gun. And you beg and you say, please, please, please. Nobody begged. Nobody groveled. Nobody cried. Nobody screamed. The message was, our avodah right now is to do tshuva, to pray that our death should be a kapara for Klal Yisrael, because the death of the righteous is a form of kapara. And Rav Dessler says, the Nazis were so spooked out that they couldn't get themselves to shoot these people. Like some of the soldiers just said to the commanders, maybe we can just let these people go. Let's maybe tomorrow we'll kill some other group. Just let them go. But unfortunately, the momentary Yetzer Tov was conquered by the much more powerful Yetzer Hara. And they were massacred. But even the Nazis, it's like sometimes a Kedusha can be so strong that it overwhelms even the Russia at the height of the Rishas. And Rav Dessler says, this is a different type of Kiddush Hashem. This is not the Kiddush Hashem in which I had a choice to save my life. And I didn't take that choice. That's one type of Kiddush Hashem. But there's a Kiddush Hashem in the way you accept your fate, in the way you deal with death, in the way that you have emunah in Hashem, even when you're facing the most difficult nisayon that a person can face. Now, even that does not address every case. As I say, that doesn't address the victim of the Holocaust who didn't believe in God or whatever it is. But Rav Dessler is pointing out that Kiddush Hashem can exist in different forms. And in some ways, obviously, in the case of the Maccabees, obviously it's Kiddush Hashem because they had a choice. They could have right? So you don't even get into the issue of the Holocaust, but it is interesting that Maccabees 1, the heroes are the soldiers. Maccabees 2, the heroes are the martyrs. And again, it's not a question of one is right and one is wrong. It's a mamash elu v'elu, divrei Elokim chayim in all of that. Okay. Good question. Yeah.
Is there any amount of kapara if a yid dies because of a yid?
Kapara for what?
If a yid gets killed because of a yid, is there any amount of kapara on his end?
Well, again, there is. I mean, the Gemara itself says anyone that dies al Kiddush Hashem, all of their averos are forgiven. So if you assume that equals Kiddush Hashem, then they're going to have it. On the other hand, as I say, it's not so pashut that statement is true. Yeah.
So especially when, like, a number of years ago, I think when Pittsburgh massacre.
The which one?
The Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
Pittsburgh shooting.
Yeah.
In Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
There were those who claimed that weren't necessarily acting in Kiddush Hashem by doing so because they weren't given the option. I just want to know, is that like what do we have to, like, what would we respond to?
Well, as I say, it may be the case. I mean, it's the same issue as the Holocaust. Meaning, does Kiddush Hashem require that you be given an option? Does Kiddush Hashem require that you face your death in a certain serenity? Now, again, I think everybody would be modeh, to take my example before. If somebody, God forbid, is in a car accident and they're killed and they happen to be Jewish, a Jewish person died in the car accident, nobody is going to say that's Kiddush Hashem. And the same thing is going to be true if you have a shooter who randomly, shoots people, and some of the victims are Jewish. Once again, that's not going to be al Kiddush Hashem. The machlokas here is when the terrorist specifically targets Jewish people, and the only reason the person is killed is because they're Jewish, as was the case in Pittsburgh, for example. So there you get into machlokas. Some will quote the Rambam Shita as saying that anybody who dies because they were a Jew is called a Kiddush Hashem, but others say that that's not emes. There either has to be the element of choice or the nobility, like Rav Dessler, in how you face death. Yeah.
How do we look at for example, it's not just the secular people who sometimes will condemn, because condemn, they say, oh well, you guys the Jews didn't fight back, so they deserve it. Since there's even some religious narrative where people will say, oh, it's because they're reformed, or because they'll say, I forget who said this, but some people said, oh, it's because they talked in shul, and so how do you know which narrative to accept? Because then they say, oh, this is a punishment from Hashem, and so if it's a punishment, how can that be Kiddush Hashem? And then some people say, well, no, look at the other people. So how do you know?
First of all, it's very important to understand the following. The Torah itself says in the Tochacha at the end of Devarim that when the Jewish people commit averos, many, many bad things are going to happen, and it goes through tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, and you can match up a lot of the psukim to what happened in the Holocaust. But the thing you need to understand is this. The Torah is describing what happens to the Jewish people when the Jewish people commit sins. It is not describing why it happened to Reuven or Shimon as opposed to somebody else. So to say that somebody died in the Holocaust because of their sin, their imperfection, we have no ability to say that at all. It might be exactly the opposite. It might be that the greatest tzaddikim, in some cases it was the greatest tzaddikim, died because we do have a principle of, I know people say it's like Christianity, but Lamaisa, Chazal tell us the death of the tzaddikim affects kapara. So you have to understand that in some ways we do regard the Holocaust as coming out of the sins of the Jewish people. But that doesn't mean that the victims of the Holocaust were sinners. The victims of the Holocaust might have been perfect tzaddikim. Maybe the Holocaust victims died because of the sins of American Jews. We can't say. So in the absence of Nevi'im that can tell you exactly why things happened, we really don't know. And once again, therefore, and by the way, just to say that if somebody died because of a sin, there's not a Kiddush Hashem, that actually is not true either. Because sometimes the very fact that God's prophecies in the Torah are vindicated is a Kiddush Hashem. Meaning, if God says, these Averis are going to cause Chorban, and a Chorban happens, that gufa is Kiddush Hashem, because that vindicates the truth of the Torah. You know, Rabbi Miller, Zichron Levracha, Rabbi Victor Miller, wrote a book about the Holocaust that he directed should not be published until after he died, because it is a controversial book, and he basically says, hey, you know, the Holocaust happened because there were a lot of things wrong in Klal Yisrael at the time. There was a lot of secularism, there was a lot of rejection of Torah in the end of the 19th century, the early decades. Now, people say, that's outrageous. You're blaming the victims. Hitler killed 6 million Jews, and you're saying, oh, the victims deserved it. No. It's not the victims deserved it. When there are Averos in Klal Yisrael, there will be Gezeiros from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That can be very, very difficult. But the particular victims might be the greatest tzaddikim. We're not saying the victims deserve it. And besides, even if the Averos created a Chi of Misa, that does not exonerate evildoers. That goes all the way back to the Bris Bein Absarim, where Hashem decrees we're going to be slaves. And then Hashem says, I'm going to punish the nation that enslaves you, because they don't have the right to do evil things. And if they do evil things, there's going to be a din v'cheshbon on it. So we separate between why God allowed it to happen and the fact that the evil people had bechira, and because they had free will, they're going to be accountable. Okay, so be it as it may, let's go back to Sefer Maccabees 1. So again, battle by battle, inch by inch, mountain by mountain, hilltop by hilltop, right? Military battles, guerrilla warfare, right? We're not going to get into all of the details. But at the end, we have the beautiful victory that the Beis HaMikdash is liberated. The Beis HaMikdash is recaptured. And it is recaptured on the 25th of Kislev. Now, what's interesting is, that is exactly the day 3 years earlier when the Yevanim had entered the Beis HaMikdash. And then we have the Hanukkah story, that the Beis HaMikdash is cleansed, it is purified. In fact, it's very difficult to imagine how they could have done everything in that one day, but let's go with that. The 25th of Kislev, they liberate the temple, they purify the temple, they remove the stones of the altar that had been desecrated by the Yevanim, by sacrificing pigs, and they built a new Mizbeach, and the menorah had been melted down and plundered as well, so they made a makeshift menorah of spears, which they soldered together, etc. And then we have the miracle of the oil, and then we have the holiday of Hanukkah. Now, there are two things that are very interesting in Maccabees 1. Maccabees 1 does describe the recapture of the Beis HaMikdash and the purification of the Beis HaMikdash. It does not mention the miracle of the Pach HaShemen, of the jar of oil. It mentions the regaining of the Beis HaMikdash, and it mentions the purification of the Beis HaMikdash. And it says, this is what it says: the Chachamim established a holiday of Chanukah, meaning dedication, because the Chanukah Sabayis, the dedication ceremony of the recaptured temple, was an 8-day dedication ceremony to parallel the 8 days of dedication of Moshe Rabbeinu in the Mishkan in the Midbar. Again, the holiday of Hanukkah, and that's what the word Hanukkah means. Hanukkah means dedication. Chanukah Sabayis. The temple had been desecrated, it had been polluted, it had been contaminated. Baruch Hashem, starting Hanukkah, there was an 8-day dedication ceremony. And we commemorate that 8-day dedication ceremony of the Beis HaMikdash by having a holiday of Hanukkah every year. And why was the dedication ceremony 8 days? Because The dedication ceremony of the Mishkan was 8 days. Why do I say 8 days? Because there were 7 preliminary days where Moshe did the service. That's the last week of Adar. And the 8th day is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, was when Aaron started the Avodah, and that's the 8th day of dedication. Now, Maharal, as I said, did not have the book of the Maccabees in Hebrew, so it's not clear that he ever read the book of the Maccabees. He never mentions the book of the Maccabees. But Maharal actually says this on his own. So this is not like some academic, apikoros idea. The Maharal says this. Maharal says, Chazal did not establish Hanukkah to commemorate the miracle of the oil. There was a miracle of the oil, but that is not why the holiday of Hanukkah was established. Maharal argues, we don't establish holidays just because of isolated miracles. Hashem did a miracle that the oil that should have burned 1 day burned 8 days. That's a nice miracle. But the things that we establish holidays about are salvations, that God saved us from an enemy, or Hashem gave us back the Beis HaMikdash. You don't stam make a holiday because a miracle happened. Therefore, Maharal says it's a davar pashut. He's mechaven to Sefer HaMaccabim. It's a davar pashut that Hanukkah is an 8-day celebration of the Chanukah Sabayas in the days of the Chashmonaim. And based on this, Maharal says, we have a beautiful answer to the famous question of the Beis Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo. This is the most famous question of Hanukkah. Everybody knows this question. We have Hanukkah is 8 days, but if they found enough oil to burn in the menorah for 1 day, and a miracle happened, and the oil burnt for 8 days, that's not 8 days of miracle. That's only 7 days of miracle. So Hanukkah should only be a 7-day holiday. It shouldn't be an 8-day holiday. This is known as the Beis Yosef's question. Although he's not the very first person who asked it. It was asked even earlier, but we all know this as the Beis Yosef's question. And there are at least 500 answers to this question. I know I have a sefer that has 500 answers. But Maharal gives such a beautiful, simple answer. He says, it's a radical answer a little bit. Hanukkah is not 8 days because of the candle, because of the oil. Had it just been the oil, Hanukkah would have been 7 days. But in point of fact, we didn't make the Yom Tov because of the oil. We made the Yom Tov because there was an 8-day dedication ceremony of the Beis HaMikdash. Hanukkah is 8 days because the Chanukah, just look at the word, the Chanukah was 8 days. That's what it was. Pashut, very, very simple. And the Maharal's teretz, even though he probably didn't see the book of the Maccabees, is exactly what the book of the Maccabees say. So Chazal tell us, Chacham adif minavi, a wise person in the Torah is greater than a prophet, that his wisdom will understand things that like a prophet understands. Now, one little point though I want to add to the Maharal, and that is, it's true that the dedication of the Mishkan, Bimei Moshe, was 8 days. Yep. But why did they model the Chanukah in the Bayis Sheni of being 8 days? When Shlomo HaMelech dedicated the first Beis HaMikdash, in the book of Malachim, Shlomo HaMelech, the dedication ceremony was 14 days. That's in the book of Malachim. In fact, it ended Shmini Atzeres, was the last day of the 14 days, which means Yom Kippur was in the middle of the dedication ceremony, and the Gemara says they actually ate on Yom Kippur that day. There was a special temporary Horas Sha'ah from Nevi'im that said the Simcha of dedication will even override Yom Kippur at one time. Remember, normally a Navi cannot abrogate a mitzvah, but if it's a Horas Sha'ah, a one-time thing, a Navi can. Just like Eliyahu was able to bring sacrifices on Mount Carmel. So the question is, why did the Chashmonaim model the Chanukah after Moshe Rabbeinu's Chanukah of 8 days? Why didn't they model it after the Chanukah of Shlomo HaMelech, which was 14 days? I mean, after all, that's actually closer to their time. So I would add the following, Kinech. I think this is a very good teretz. The Medrash tells us, when did the Jewish people begin to build the Mishkan? The Jewish people began to build the Mishkan right after Yom Kippur, right? Moshe Rabbeinu comes down on Yom Kippur with the second Luchos. The sin of the golden calf was forgiven. The day after Yom Kippur, he gathers people together and he tells them about the Mishkan, and people begin donating, and B'Tzalel begins to make the Aron and all the different things. Right? So they began the day after Yom Kippur. When were they finished? So there's a Pesikta, a Medrash Pesikta, that says they actually finished the Mishkan in Kislev. They were ready to dedicate the Mishkan in Kislev. But Hashem didn't want the Mishkan to be dedicated in Kislev. He wanted to defer the dedication of the Mishkan until Nisan, because Nisan is the month of redemption, and Nisan is the month of the birth of Yitzchak, and that's an interesting question, that the Mishkan was to be connected with the birth of Yitzchak. So, as the Midrashim often say, the month of Kislev was distraught. The month of Kislev, whatever that means exactly, complained to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how can you deprive me of the right to be the month of dedication? So Hashem promised the month of Kislev, there will come a future time in which you will be the month of the dedication of the Bayit Sheni. So now you can understand why, when the Chashmonaim made a Chanukah Sabayas, they did it the 8 days of Moshe rather than the 14 days of Shlomo. Very pashut. Because the whole point of the Chanukah in the month of Kislev was to make up to Kislev what it missed in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. So it has to correspond to the Chanukah of Moshe Rabbeinu. By the way, they similarly say that, so in other words, the Chanukah of the Bayis Sheni is a make-up to Kislev for missing the Chanukah of the Mishkan. Now, there's a similar teaching about the Chanukah of Shlomo, that when they were building the Beis HaMikdash, they actually completed the Beis HaMikdash Cheshvan, that's 11 months before Tishrei, Cheshvan, and Hashem wanted to delay it until Tishrei, which was the month of creation. So Cheshvan has a complaint that we were deprived of being a dedication. So the promise is Cheshvan will be the month of the dedication of the third Beis HaMikdash. So it's very interesting that the Mishkan was dedicated the end of Adar and Nisan, and it should have been Kislev. So the Bayis Sheni dedication is a makeup for what Kislev lost at the time of the Mishkan. And similarly, the first Beis HaMikdash was dedicated in Tishrei, but it should have been the Cheshvan before. And the makeup for that is going to be the Cheshvan of the Bayis Shalishi, right? So it turns out that Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev are the 3 months of dedication. Tishrei is the dedication of the first Beis HaMikdash. And then we have Cheshvan is the dedication of the third Beis HaMikdash. Kislev was the major dedication of the second Beis HaMikdash. Now, one little qualification about that. I just want to point out that you might be thinking, why do I say Hanukkah means dedication, but why do I call that the dedication of the second Beis HaMikdash? That's technically not correct. The second Beis HaMikdash was built before the Hanukkah story. The second Beis HaMikdash was built during Persian reign. Hanukkah simply is what they did after the Yevonim contaminated the temple, so they rededicated it. But why do I consider Hanukkah to be the Iker dedication of the Bayis Sheni, what about the Chanukah in the times of Ezra, Zerubbabel, in other words, earlier? So the answer is the Sfarim tell us that although there certainly was a Chanukah Sabayis, much earlier when they built the second temple, but since we were under Persian domination, it doesn't have the Chashivas. Hanukkah is the Chanukah under Jewish independence, although that'll be a kasha as well. Therefore, the Iker Chinuch of the Mikdash is when you don't have Shibud Malchios. The earlier Chanukah of the Bayis Sheni was the environment of Shibud Malchios. Another thing I just want to point out, and this is true both for the Bayis Sheni at the beginning and even during Hanukkah. You know, when you look at pictures, this is again just a Pasha thing, when you look at pictures of the Bayis Sheni, or models of the Bayis Sheni, and even when you learn the Mishnah Maseches Midos about the Bayis Sheni, what is being described is the magnificent building of Herod. Herod was the Roman appointed king. He was a non-Jew, and he was crazy, and he murdered many, many people, but he was the great architect. He was the one who made the magnificence of the Bayis Sheni. And it didn't last for that many years. It was less than 100 years till that was destroyed. The Herodian temple was destroyed around 100 years after it was built. But you have to understand that the Bayis Sheni that existed before Herod for almost 300 years was a much simpler building. So we don't really have detailed visualizations of it because the description in Chazal is of the Herodian temple. So we don't really know what the Beis HaMikdash looked like in the time of the Maccabees and certainly in the time of the Persian kings. But be aware that don't, just in terms of your own visualization, that all of the great pictures and diagrams and models that you see of the Bayis Sheni are the Herodian temple that is much, much later. Okay, this was not as glorious a structure in Gashmias as the Herodian temple. Okay, so this is, again, the idea of, the Maharal says, is a beautiful, beautiful answer to the Beis Yosef's kasha. Why is Hanukkah 8 days if the miracle was only 7 days? The answer is, Hanukkah is not 8 days because of the miracle of the oil. Hanukkah is 8 days because of Chanukah's Habayis, and the Chanukah's Habayis of the Mishkan was 8 days, and Hanukkah is paralleling the Chanukah's Habayis of the Mishkan. And again, not only is that the reason for Hanukkah, but the book of the Maccabees does not even mention the miracle of the oil. Now that itself is a good kasha, meaning even if that's not the reason for the Yom Tov, it was a great miracle, why doesn't it mention it? That is a good kasha. But once again, it could very well be that if you think about this, a miracle involving the menorah is a very, very, very private miracle. The menorah is in the Heichal. First of all, a lot of Jews aren't living in Yerushalayim, and if you are, you can't go into, the only people who can go into the Heichal are Kohanim. So this was not a miracle that many people saw. Moreover, in some ways, although it was unique, but it was not such an unusual miracle. Remember that the menorah had 7 lamps, and there always was a ner that didn't go out. That was the ner tamid. Do we have a ner tamid here? I don't know. We don't have it here, but above many Aron HaKodeshes, you have a ner tamid in commemoration of the ner in the Beis HaMikdash that didn't go out, at least when we're righteous. So Hanukkah was a chiddush that all 7 neros didn't go out. But even before Hanukkah, there was one ner that didn't go out, right? So in a sense, it wasn't so unusual. It was an intensification of a pre-existing miracle. And it was also a very private miracle that nobody would really see, right? The average person wouldn't have seen this miracle. So as a result, although we vadai believe that it happened, but in the book of the Maccabees, it does not mention the nace of the Pach HaShemen. Again, I'll talk more about what the implications of that is. So, have a good day.